We surveyed Purdue students about climate change. We asked them, what do you think about the future of climate change? Here are their responses.
I think climate change is already pretty bad, but we will definitely have to take some steps to mediate it if we want it to improve at all in the future.
I feel like a lot of political leaders have put skepticism into the minds of the people, and if we don't do something about it, then it's going to continue to grow worse, and it's not going to be well for our future.
So I think maybe the summer will be hotter and winter will be colder.
I think it's kind of sporadic and kind of off right now. I think it's only going to get worse in the future because it seems like even here in Indiana, the seasons are longer and misplaced, or it seems like a little bit different than what it was like when I was growing up.
No, I mean, I think it's hard to say because I think like right now we're not really on a path for things to improve yet. We haven't quite taken the steps we need to fix the problem. So like we're still having greenhouse emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are not at a sustainable level. We aren't really taking the steps to implement renewable, sustainable infrastructure. So I think that eventually people are going to realize that there's a problem and then kind of scramble to change it. But I think it's going to get a little bit worse. And we're going to see some of the problems like increased flooding, like ice melting, just problems like that. They're going to keep getting worse for a little while until people really realize that they feel that there's a problem.
My hope for the future is that firstly we can get other people to recognize that climate change is indeed real, that we have scientific research from people who know what they're talking about, that have studied this for a while. So my hope for the future of climate change is that we can get other people around not only the US but the world to acknowledge that climate change is real, and that in the future, so our future generations of children and grandchildren, that their lives will be better because we'll be able to get a better handle on how to work with climate change.
I think very anxious thoughts about the future of climate change. I know that there's a lot of data out there that suggests things are going badly, and that unless we act quickly on like a global level, it's not going to end well, especially for people who are already marginalized, such as people in poverty, who are living in areas that are going to be highly affected by this.
I think it's going to get worse if we don't do anything about it.
I think since the Earth goes in natural cycles of heating and cooling, I think it'll eventually even itself out.
Okay, climate change. I don't know a lot about it. I know it's happening. It kind of freaks me out, but like also I'll be dead. So
Geez, I think people really need to get their act together because we keep up what we're doing with pollution. We're not gonna have water in our rivers. We're just gonna have tips and rock, and they're gonna say, "What's that?" They're gonna say, "Oh, there used to be a river there." And there go the fish, and then there go other great things. The atmosphere, the ozone, gone. Sun rays on us. SPF doesn't work, and so it's not looking great.
Oh boy, we're kind of screwed, Like you can already see the changes of how weekly it's like in the single digits, and it's going to be 50 this weekend.
There's
so I think we need to
evidence
change it.
for it.
Yeah.
And I can't really get my mind around how people still don't believe it.
As you can see, there is a mix of thoughts about the future of global warming. However, there are far more people who acknowledge global warming and realize that something must be done about it. This is common at universities for more people to be aware about climate change, but there are still so many people in the world that deny it or do not think it is a big issue. After interviewing various students and faculty, we decided to get the opinion of someone who researches climate change and climate change policy. We talked to Dr. Manana Milcret, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Purdue. She provided some very interesting and frightening insight to the future of climate change if many people continue to ignore it. We first asked her about the implications of doing nothing to address the issue of rising temperatures. Here's what she had to say.
So you can start thinking about this basically by looking at how much the temperature has already risen, which is about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we're already seeing a whole range of implications, right? So we're seeing how the global temperature on average is rising. We're seeing that affects weather patterns, creating more extreme weather events. Also, things like the polar vortex, which just deep froze the Midwest, including where you guys are, for a few days. And that's the reason for that is a changing jet stream pattern. So the jet stream comes further south occasionally and brings Arctic air. So even that is related to climate change. We're seeing changes in agriculture. Some of the agricultural seasons are either lengthening or shortening, or plant growth is changing. So that can have massive implications for our food production in the world. We see sea levels rising, which means a whole lot for all countries with coastlines, and a whole lot for small island states. Some of those small island states have already lost so much territory and seen so much saltwater intrusion that they had to leave their home. People have to move away, leave their country, and relocate to other countries because of climate change. So we're creating homelessness, we're creating the destruction of countries, we're creating food disruption, we're definitely creating a lot of changes and probably extinction and death in the environment, in our ecosystems. Lots of species will probably not survive what is coming down the road. That will change the consistency of ecosystems. Our world is going to look very different. It starts right now in California with tons of wildfires. You can see it everywhere.
Her insights go along with much of our research as well. According to the NPR, a lack of action on climate change initiatives would change the world significantly. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts an increase in global temperature of around 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the next century. This would lead to rising sea levels and therefore environmental migration because people living on coasts will be ousted from their homes. Dr. Milkeret then discussed the implications of climate change in the ocean and expanded on the implications for the rest of the world.
The ocean is another huge area where things are going to change in terms of ocean temperatures are rising, and the ocean is more acidifying, which creates a whole lot of trouble for lots of species living in the ocean, including those that provide a lot of food for humans. And again, those things are all connected. So it's going to happen everywhere. It's going to affect pretty much everything in the way we live, where we live, how healthy and how sick we are. It's going to affect where diseases take place, how they spread. It's going to affect how our infrastructure is going to deal with temperature. It's going to be everywhere. So I think implications are huge. If we do nothing, I don't think that the way we currently organize our societies can continue to exist this way. There's going to be lots of destabilization because temperatures will go way above anything we can imagine. So the numbers usually don't mean a lot. If I tell you that's going to be 4 or 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, that doesn't mean anything to you. But in terms of the impacts, that really isn't a place humans are capable of existing in the way we do today. So the places where we could exist fairly pleasantly will shrink while human population is still growing a little bit. And even that on its own presents a massive challenge, right? People will have to move to places where we can still live, work outside, be outside, produce food and stuff. And those places will be fewer. So there will be less land mass where life is going to be possible and good.
She then discussed ways to slow down climate change and the necessary actions to take regarding climate change.
One thing is we have to address the causes of climate change, right? We want climate change to slow down, ideally to stop. I don't think that's possible anymore, but we want to manage how much more climate change we get. And the way to do that, that's called mitigation. It's basically reducing our greenhouse gases to ideally get to zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as we can as societies. And that requires quite easily and straightforward the price on carbon, right? We have to stop emitting carbon, which means we have to reduce the amounts of fossil fuels we dig out of the earth. So we should, whatever is still in there in terms of coal and oil and gas, ideally not extract that, and move our societies to a renewable energy foundation. That's very difficult and it's a long-term project, but it's necessary. And then there are a whole lot of another area of policy is adaptation, adjusting to the impacts of climate change. And every society has to do that in multiple forms. Whether we're going to build seawalls like California, like Florida right now is already dealing with a lot of saltwater intrusion even on sunny days because seawater is rising. Or you have bigger storms that damage your coastline and properties along coastlines. You got to figure out how to deal with those changes. You also have to make adaptations in food production in the Midwest, for example, all kinds of things. So adaptation is a very diverse area of policies that are needed. That's a second one. And then I guess there's also a third area that has to do with international justice and richer developed countries helping poorer countries, especially by providing them with financial means and technology and other kinds of support so that the developing countries can deal with their climate change problems as well. But that's more of an international relations problem. That is a different kind of policy. So those three areas I think I distinguish, and a lot can and should be done in all of them.
Finally, she discussed how the world may change their work towards slowing down climate change after the actions in the United States has taken to roll back regulations and increase carbon emissions.
The US stepping back is really challenging for the rest of the world because the US plays a really big role when it comes to climate change internationally. First of all, historically, the US has emitted most emissions. So they are the biggest contributor to climate change as we know it today, and they continue to be the second largest emitter today. And without the US doing anything about their domestic emissions, it's going to be really hard to get the world to where it needs to go in a short time period. And we need to go, these changes have to happen soon. So for the world to move forward, it would be hard to replace any action by the US. I think temporarily the rest of the world has decided they will just move ahead without the US because they can't wait for the US, which is good. Most of the world is kind of saying, all right, let's do this anyway, despite the American position right now, which is making this harder for everybody else. Given that the US plays such a big role and currently behaves really irresponsibly on the global stage by not, picking up its own bill, that gives other countries cover to do the same. They don't even have to say it out loud, right? They just have to sit back and just not work as hard as they could at home to reduce their own emissions or work on their own adaptation. So they can just point to the United States and say, well, those guys have a much bigger impact and much more responsibility, and they're not doing it. Why should we? So, and I think we might see a little bit of that, for example, with Brazil right now. Brazil's new president has a very similar stance to Donald Trump. Fortunately, I would say we see a lot of positive trends in the US at the sub-national level, like lots of states and municipalities and even companies and universities are actually stepping up and doing a lot, have been doing a lot for, I would say, more than a decade now, to say, well, we can't wait for Washington to make up its mind. We're going to move ahead anyway, right? We're going to reduce our emissions as far as we can, and we're going to start thinking about adaptation here locally. And so those things are important. I think they can make a difference, although they cannot really make up for the policy vacuum left by the federal government at the moment. So it's a little bit of a glimmer of hope, but it's not sufficient in my view to really get us to where we need to go.
Ultimately, if climate change is not addressed soon with the appropriate weight given to it, the world as we know it today will no longer exist. We hope that more people will acknowledge global warming so that smaller, local communities of people don't have to be the only actors to slow down climate change. Countries including the United States need to step up and take responsibility for the situation we are in and need to hold themselves accountable so that generations in the future have a world to live in.
climate change isn't real.